My name is Anna Christ. I am a certified floodplain manager and an outreach coordinator with the state of Nebraska Floodplain Management Division. I will bring the majority of this presentation today, but I will be assisted by Elijah Kaufman. The presentation that we're going to be covering today is our higher standards going beyond the minimums to protect your community. So with this, we'll do an introduction into some of the higher standards and some of the benefits that come along with those. All right, so that brings us to our agenda for today. We will start out with doing just a basic introduction to floodplain regulations, breaking down where those start and why we regulate floodplains. We'll introduce higher standards, break down a few of the possible higher standards that are available and the benefits for those. We'll break down our new guide to higher standards. That's a part of our new model ordinance. We'll go over just general benefits for adopting higher standards and then tips for enforcing those higher standards in your community. We will get started with just a basic introduction into floodplain regulations. So a big question that I'm sure a lot of you floodplain administrators get asked, and we get asked here at the state, is why do we have to have floodplain regulations for development? Some of the reasons are just to decrease damages caused by flooding, keeping development outside of the floodplain to reduce those damages, reduce the risk of loss of life and property. We want to keep people safe during flooding events. There's also the agreement that's created with the National Flood Insurance Program between the government and participating communities. So this agreement is that the federal government will provide floodplain insurance to communities as long as they are regulating the development that happens within those floodplains. So this enables property owners participating communities to purchase that flood insurance as protection against flood losses. And this participation is voluntary and based solely on that agreement between local communities and the federal government. Additionally, regulating development within floodplains is meant to protect the floodplains and their natural functions, so preserving the flood-prone areas so that floodwaters have a place to go away from highly developed areas, maintaining water quality in the area, and then supporting plant and animal populations as well. So there are a couple different levels to floodplain regulations. They start at the federal level with the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 44, Part 60.3. That Code of Federal Regulations sets the national standard for minimum standard for floodplain regulation across the country. And then at the state level, Nebraska has our own administrative code, Title 455, Chapter 1, which sets the state standards, which meet and exceed the federal level. An example of this is Nebraska has adopted a few higher standards, one being the 1 foot freeboard requirement for development within the floodplain. And then the state and federal minimum standards are then enforced at the local level with the Nebraska Revised Statute, Chapter 31, Article 10. This gives participating communities the authority to enforce these regulations within their own communities. And these communities are required to adopt a floodplain ordinance that meets or exceeds the federal and state minimum standards, where all these regulations are listed at. This is just an image that kind of shows the progression of those regulations. So they start out at the federal level with the national minimum standards. Nebraska has our own standards that then exceed those minimums. And then the local jurisdiction the local ordinance, where all those regulations are kept, is then meant to meet or exceed the federal and state minimums. So going into a little bit more detail about the local level enforcement, local communities that participate in the NFIP adopt regulations through a local ordinance. This is required to join the National Flood Insurance Program. So every community that participates has a floodplain ordinance. If you can't find it or don't know where it is, or you're not sure that you have one, contact us. We may have one on file. If not, we can help you draft a new copy. Our Nebraska State Model Ordinance is specifically designed to meet all state and federal minimum standards. So if you are basing your ordinance off of our model, it should have all of the required language necessary to make it compliant for the National Flood Insurance Program. Communities then have the option to adopt higher standards, which are more individualized regulations for your community's flood risk. And we'll get into that with the rest of this presentation. So this is just the authority that, or the language that gives local government the authority to adopt higher floodplain standards. So this is what's written out in the Nebraska Revised Statutes. As well as this language giving local authority the jurisdiction to enforce these regulations. So that just brings us to our higher standards. There are a ton of different kinds of higher standards that are available for communities to adopt. Our model ordinance does not include all of the options for higher standards, so this is not a comprehensive list whatsoever. But we have broken down some of the options that we have available in our model ordinance into a couple different categories. So we have administrative higher standards. These standards establish additional administrative procedures and influence how a community processes and reviews floodplain development permit applications. There are developmental and construction-based higher standards. So they set higher construction standards for new development. This includes elevation standards, limitations on elevation methods, and regulations on things like critical facilities. There are also prohibitory higher standards, which fully restrict certain activities within the floodplain, floodway, or both. And then there are standards that fit strictly with the existing or non-conforming use structures. So these just adjust the definitions for substantial improvement and substantial damage. So those are the four categories we're going to be covering today, but we will go ahead and get more specific with some specific standards that are available for adoption. So starting with the administrative higher standards, the first one we'll talk about is the Certified Floodplain Management requirement for the Floodplain Administrator. This standard requires the Floodplain Administrator to become a Certified Floodplain Manager after the start of employment. Now, the typical language for this is, I believe, they would have to get the certification within a year of starting this job. Communities can adjust that timeline as needed. You would take the CFM exam, which can be available online, sometimes in person, depending on where you're located. And you can do training leading up to that exam, help with that. one of which being the 273 class, which is provided by FEMA. We had this class at State Building this past year. It's always available, so if you have information on that, feel free to contact us and get you to take the CFM exam, but it does provide a lot of good information to help with that. Once the floodplain administrator becomes certified, they must attend continuing education training to maintain the credential. And a little piece of information on that, most of our trainings that we provide, either online or in person, do offer those continuing education credits that work for CFMs or treasurers. Okay. So why should you adopt this language? This higher standards ensures that the position of floodplain administrator is filled with a qualified, well-trained floodplain manager. For the floodplain administrators that are online right now, you know that the job has a lot of different aspects to it, and some of which can be pretty technical. So having that training, knowing how to do that, can be extremely valuable for your position. Floodplain administrators have to be trained on calculating base flood elevations, following the floodplain permitting process, understanding the NFIP minimum standards, and just being a trusted resource for the community. So going through that training could be valuable not only for you in your role, but also for your community as well. The next administrative standard that we'll talk about is the administrative procedures for reviewing letters of map revision based on fill applications. If you get a project development for your community, somebody wants to bring in fill and build on top of it, it is the floodplain administrator's responsibility for ensuring that whatever is built on that fill is built reasonably safe from flooding. So one way to do that is to require developers to follow FEMA's Technical Bulletin 10, which ensures that what they are building on top of fill will be reasonably safe from flooding. This higher standard provides written procedures for communities considering signing a community acknowledgement form, which is necessary when you are dealing with this type of development. And it clearly establishes local expectations for building on filled land. So what are the benefits of this higher standard? Communities are required to sign off on any LOMAR F applications certifying these statements. So the community has to certify that they are aware that fill was placed in the special flood hazard area or your regulatory floodplain. The development has been permitted. The fill is not in the regulatory floodway. All current and future development will be reasonably safe from flooding. So having this information in your ordinance certifies that you are following that specific procedure. The developer is following specific procedures to make sure that the development will be reasonably safe from flooding and done the correct way. So it's just creating that standard procedure in the ordinance when you're reviewing each of those statements. The next one we'll cover is setting time limits for permit validity. So generally when a developer is doing a project within the floodplain, they have 180 days after the floodplain development permit is approved to begin work on the project. And then after that, as long as that timeline is followed, the permit will be good for the life of the project unless otherwise specified. So communities have the authority to set time limits on when a project can be completed or the lifetime of the permit after the project is done. So it's important if you do decide to adopt this higher standard to align these time limits with those of other existing permit timelines. So if you have timelines for zoning permits, building permits, utility permits, take a look at those so you're staying consistent. Those could be 6 months, a year, whatever you already have set for your community. But this language assures that there is consistency across all other administrative procedures, and it requires reapplication for a new permit after that time limit expires, or the developer may request for an extension of the existing permit. So why is it beneficial? Some projects may take months or years to complete. So having that time frame ensures that projects are moving at a reasonable pace and getting done when they should. It helps the community monitor changes in conditions over time. So if the scope of work changes that fall outside of the original permit's description, you can monitor that and make sure that there's a new permit that comes into place that covers that scope of work. Or if your community goes through a mapping change and gets new floodplain maps, having that time frame set allows you to reevaluate those changes. And then this is also great if you have any continuous operations within your floodplain. So if you have any businesses that are located within your floodplain that do any sort of storage of equipment or materials, setting a time limit for the permit's validity allows you to come back, check up on what the work they're doing in the floodplain and keeping that relationship there.
Sorry, I was double muted. There we go. This was something I wanted to add. We've been working with communities a lot recently about the mining operations and excavation operations that are happening in the floodplain. The reason I put the new floodplain maps point there is to say that we had a project that had been going on since the early 90s. And since then, that county has received 2 iterations of new floodplain maps. So they've gone through 2 sets of new floodplain maps. And as the project has expanded its territory, it was working under the same permit from back in the 90s. And they've since expanded into new flood zones and have new regulations that they weren't catching because that they were under the assumption that they could work under that same permit. So having this kind of language, even if it's, even if you set the expectation as 5 years, for example, the permit is good for 5 years, it still allows you to have that check-in during that time, after that set amount of time, and having them reapply so that you can take into account anything that might have changed. So this is a good one that I think a lot of you should consider.
Awesome. So some additional benefits to adopting permit time limits. It again just ensures that developers are routinely aware of floodplain requirements over time, so that relationship and communication doesn't break down. Those requirements are brought to attention every so often after that permit expires, and you can assure that the activities that are happening in the floodplain are staying consistent with the permit's requirements. So here's kind of what that model language would look like if you were to put that into your ordinance. You can see there is a time period for when development should occur, and then there's a place to apply an extension time period if necessary. So going along with that higher standard, there is another standard that you can implement that puts time limits on proof of compliance. So this requires any post-construction certified administrator within a certain time frame after construction is complete. So this would include your elevation certificates or any proof of elevations, proof of project completion, site inspection, photographs, letters of map change, anything that falls within is necessary for that post-construction proof of compliance. This would put that time limit on there. And again, it's just meant to ensure that projects are completed in compliance with the issued permit. So purpose and benefits of this, post-construction documentation is sometimes forgotten about after the permit is provided, but that is something that's necessary when we come in and do community assistance contacts, double check administrative procedures. We want to see this documentation. So making sure that you are staying on top of it and collecting all of the necessary documentation. Putting a time limit on that can be beneficial to make sure it doesn't get forgotten. Ensures expectations are clearly communicated and codified. So communicating with the developer, making sure they know what's expected of them. Helps the community obtain that proof of compliance within a reasonable time frame and provides additional legal backing for enforcement if documentation is not provided. So if the developer does not provide that proof of compliance, you have written language within your ordinance that helps you ensure that you do get that proof as needed. So this is what that language would look like. If you were to put that in your ordinance, it just has the time frame that you can set. You can decide that as a community, what works best for you. Again, look at other ordinances or regulations that you have for your community to stay consistent.
And this example language is just pulled from the structural stuff, but obviously proof of compliance means other things besides an elevation certificate. So this is just one excerpt from that additional language.
So now we'll move on to some of the developmental higher standards that we have. The first one that we'll talk about is the higher freeboard requirements. So first we just start out with what freeboard is. It's a factor of safety, usually expressed in feet above flood level for the purpose of floodplain management. And it's meant to compensate for the many unknown factors that could contribute to flood heights greater than the height calculated for a select size of flood and floodway conditions. This can include your wave action, clogged bridge openings, hydrological effect of urbanization of the watershed. So having a higher freeboard is just meant to factor in additional effects that might be had on the floodplain and protect development within the floodplain. So in the image, you can just see where the base flood elevation is shown, and then the freeboard, the house is elevated to that 1 foot freeboard requirement. All right. So in Nebraska, the state has adopted a higher minimum standard than the federal level, which is that it requires a 1 foot freeboard statewide for all development in the floodplain. So communities can require additional freeboard of their choosing, whether you want it to be an additional half a foot or a full additional foot or higher than that. Depending on whatever your flood risk is, you can make that decision as a community. But this regulation then does apply to not only elevating a structure, but to dry flood-proof structures as well. So why adopt this language? It acknowledges that higher floods may occur. So the regulatory floodplain is the 1% annual chance floodplain. There are some areas that do experience higher or larger floods than that. So it's taking that into account. It helps compensate for increased flood heights caused by other developments. It ensures that structures are built with a margin of safety above the base flood elevation, reduces the risk of flood damages and the loss of life or property, and it can potentially reduce insurance rates, which we will talk about a little bit later in this presentation. But there are a lot of benefits to increasing that freeboard. And this is what that model language looks like. There are a few different places in the ordinance that state what the freeboard requirement is, whether it's related to residential structures, non-residential structures, or manufactured homes. You would just plug in whatever your freeboard requirement is into those different spots. The next developmental standard is elevating or flood-proofing HVAC or mechanical equipment. So elevating this type of equipment, HVAC units, to the lowest floor level is a pretty common practice, but it's not required by state or federal minimum standards. So putting this requirement into your ordinance will require new construction to elevate or flood-proof and reduce the risk of property damage and the loss of services to that structure. Again, this is another higher standard that could help reduce flood insurance costs for the development. Moving on, we have regulating critical facilities. So this higher standard establishes specific regulations for facilities that are considered to be critical to the continuous operation of the community in times of disaster. So this includes hospitals, first responder facilities like fire departments, retirement homes, facilities that store hazardous materials, and other community lifelines that would be essential for the function of the community. So this language regulates these types of facilities vertically, as in adding additional freeboard requirements, and horizontally. So it not only applies to the 1% annual chance floodplain or the regulatory floodplain, but also applies to the 0.2% annual chance floodplain. So on this image, you can see the regulatory floodplain is shown in blue, and then the 0.2% annual chance floodplain is shown in that yellowy orangish color. So these requirements would extend out to the orange shaded area. So these requirements also requires the facility to have at least one access road connected to land outside of the 1% and 0.2% annual chance floodplain. These roads must be capable of carrying emergency support vehicles, and the top of the access road must be no lower than the flood protection elevation. So that's the freeboard above the 1% and 0.2% annual chance floodplain. So making sure that there are safe roads outside of the floodplain so people can evacuate or emergency vehicles can be mobilized. So why are these regulations important? They ensure higher development standards for hospitals, first responder facilities, and retirement homes so that they are not affected in times of flood or large disastrous flood events. Keeps the community functional during and after a flood event. Increases community resiliency, so there are the critical facilities are not damaged during flood events, and it's easier for the community to bounce back. And then when larger flood occurs, we want to make sure that the facilities that need to respond can respond. You don't want your first responders to be stuck in a flood when they could be helping the rest of the community. The next developmental higher standard is setbacks. This is a relatively new higher standard that we've included in our new model ordinance. This is the expansion of a regulated area under the floodplain ordinance. So it requires developments to be located a set distance away from a watercourse or a floodplain or floodway boundary. So with this language, communities can customize it a little bit. You can choose which watercourses the setbacks will apply to, where the setback will be measured from, if it's measured from the floodway boundary, the top of a channel bank, or the center line of a watercourse, how large the setback area will be, and the different types of development that will be prohibited in the setback area. So this is meant to ensure safe development practices on stream or floodplain adjacent land. But the biggest benefit to this is preserving the natural functions of the floodplain. By keeping this area free of developments, it allows the floodplain to function as it should, allowing water to flow away from the development in the area. And for communities that do not have a designated floodway area, it can help create an area that's set aside to convey the floodwaters, which would act similar to a floodway boundary. All right, these next few developmental standards are sort of in a subcategory of their own, which are all related to enclosures below the lowest floor. The first one deals with non-conversion agreements. So per state and federal minimum standards, enclosures below the lowest floor can only be used for limited storage, parking, or access to the upper floors. Communities can require a signed non-conversion agreement between the community and property owner to better ensure that these areas are not converted post-construction. So it can be difficult to make sure that the use of these areas stay consistent with what is supported by the permit. Having this non-conversion agreement helps set that requirement and expectation. And you can file these deed restrictions with the county office of the Register of Deeds. So if there's any transfer of ownership, that requirement gets passed on. So again, ensures that the expectation is clearly communicated and codified. It's communicated during any transfers of ownership, and it provides that legal backing for enforcement. So it's just putting that language in your ordinance to help back you up if you need to use it. So this is an example of what a non-conversion agreement would look like. We do have a few templates that are available if you are ever interested or need one. Again, it's just an agreement between the property owner and the community saying that, or setting the expectations for the use of the structure. And it may allow for inspections, which are used to ensure that the use of the structure is still compliant with the permit. We have 3 different types, and the biggest difference between them are the inspection language. Type A requires an annual inspection. Type B sets the standard that the community has the right to inspect at any time. And then type C does not have any mentions of inspections. Depending on what type of development is going on, you could use either type, whichever one works best for the circumstance. These are also just templates, so if you need to add any additional language or alter some of the language that is available, we recommend talking to your local legal counsel, and you can also talk to us as well for recommendations on that. So the next regulation that deals with enclosures below the lowest floor is limiting the size. This language limits the size of garages, storage areas, or stairwells below the lowest floor of the building. This language does not require size limits on crawl spaces with heights lower than 5 feet below the top of the next highest floor. So keep that in mind if you are dealing with this higher standard. But the community may choose to set the size limits. In the model language, there is a recommended size limit, but again, it's up to the community's discretion on that. And you can regulate the square footage of the structure, both vertical, or the square footage and both vertical. So there are some different options with that. Benefits of this are reducing the structure's footprint below the base flood elevation and reducing the overall impact on floodwater elevations. And then it minimizes the quantity of stored items or vehicles in harm's way that may be stored in these areas. Remember, enclosures below lowest floor typically have that wet flood proof requirement. So water is meant to flow through these areas freely. You don't want people to store a ton of belongings or highly expensive belongings in this area that could be subject to flood damage. And then next, we just listed out some of the prohibitory higher standards. There's not a whole lot of detail that we've put into this, as they are just meant to fully prohibit these types of developments. So communities have the option to prohibit all development within the floodway, prohibit manufactured homes in the floodplain, prohibit recreational vehicles in floodways or floodplains, prohibit new or replacement on-site waste disposal systems, prohibit the use of fill, prohibit dry floodproofing for non-residential structures, or prohibit enclosures below the lowest floor. Now, when you're considering these options, again, look at some of your other ordinances that your community may have. If your community already prohibits manufactured homes within your jurisdiction, prohibiting manufactured homes within the floodplain would be a good option to include in your floodplain ordinance, just to make sure you're staying consistent. And then we'll move on to the regulations that apply to existing and non-conforming use higher standards. So the first one we'll talk about is lowering the substantial damage, substantial improvement threshold. The state and federal minimum regulation for substantial damage and substantial improvement is the 50% threshold. So the cost of repairs or improvement that are 50% or more of a structure's market value then fall into that substantial damage, substantial improvement definition. Communities can choose to lower that percentage threshold for what is considered new construction. Additionally, you can also implement cumulative tracking. So this would be tracking the cost of repairs and or improvements over a set period of time, whether that be a year, 5 years, 10 years. It's keeping track of that, which would then need additional administrative procedures to make sure that tracking is done correctly. So the purpose of these are for lowering the threshold. It further helps reduce the number of non-conforming or at-risk structures in the floodplain over time by making sure these structures are mitigated and protected from flooding. Your community may have lower thresholds for grandfathered or non-conforming use structures, conditions in other ordinances. So again, staying consistent across the board with that. And then with cumulative tracking, it helps with tracking phased improvements. A lot of the time, if people know that there is a threshold that they have to be aware of, they will do larger projects in different phases to help reduce the cost for that threshold. So it helps eliminate that, so you don't have extremely expensive, unprotected houses in the floodplain. And it helps mitigate structures that routinely experience flood loss below the substantial damage threshold. So instead of continuously experiencing flood damages, once they reach that threshold within a certain time, then they can be brought into compliance with your ordinance and protected from flooding. And then the next one is including the definition for repetitive loss with your substantial damage definition. So repetitive loss structures are those that have a history of being damaged by flooding. The definition for repetitive loss that is put into your community ordinance may be different than the insurance definition. The general definition for that is repetitive loss structure is one that has experienced any flood-related damage on 2 separate occasions during a 10-year period, where the cost of repair after each event averages 25% of the structure's market value. So again, the community definition may be a little bit different, but with this, a structure that is experienced repetitive flood damage would then be brought into compliance when it meets that substantial damage threshold. Benefits of this, NFIP policyholders that meet the substantially damaged threshold qualify for increased cost of compliance coverage. So this allows for an additional $30,000 on top of any flood insurance claim. And the NFIP will help pay the added cost of bringing the structures into compliance with the local floodplain ordinances for new construction. So adding that repetitive loss then opens up that increased cost of compliance coverage for those types of structures. So I will kind of go through this a little bit quickly as we're running a little short on time, and we do have a recorded video about this already on our website, but our new model ordinance does have a guide to optional or hired standards at the very end of the ordinance. With our old model, the optional language was just fit within the ordinance itself. With all this being at the end, it just allows for more room to provide descriptions on the higher standards, provide instructions on how to use it, and offers that plug and play functionality. So it'll tell you exactly where it will go in your model ordinance and how to use it. And then we also have little descriptions for community rating system class prerequisites as well for each of the standards that apply. So again, this is just how it looked in our current model ordinance versus our new model ordinance. It's a little bit less clunky, more organized, and easier to use with all of the optional language at the end. And this is how it looks on our guide. We have the descriptions for the optional standard. So if you are working with your governing body or your board and you're trying to describe why these standards are necessary or beneficial, there is a brief description in this document for you to use for that. Again, the plug and play functionality, there are boxes that show exactly where the new language should be placed within your ordinance. And then for the specific standards that apply, there's the additional note for the CRS prerequisites. And then this new guide does include some new standards that weren't available in our current model. So that includes the limiting timelines for permit validity, timelines for proof of compliance, the elevation of HVAC and mechanical equipment, the expansion of substantial damage to include repetitive loss, non-conversion agreements for enclosures below the lowest floor, and now setbacks as well. All right, so we'll just go through some of the general benefits for adopting higher standards. So local enforcement authority means that the communities can adopt higher floodplain standards that exceed state or federal minimum standards. These higher standards can better protect from flood risk by reducing the loss of life and property, reduce the risk of damages due to flooding, and generally encourage proactive development, so protecting these structures before flooding occurs instead of reacting after a flood event happens. So these higher standards increase the safety of community members, reduce the effects of development on the floodplain, maintain the floodplain's natural functions, reduce financial and structural damages for property owners, encourage faster recovery after a disaster, and have the potential to lower flood insurance premiums. So just some general statistics that can help you support adopting higher floodplain standards. 1 foot of freeboard generally only adds 0.25% to 1.5% to a total construction cost for a new building. So the cost for additional freeboard will pay for itself within the first 5 to 10 years of a structure's lifetime through reduced damages and insurance costs. And property owners save around 20% per year on flood insurance costs with 1 foot of freeboard. Communities that spend $1 on community resilience typically save around $7. So there's a benefit in spending the extra time to build safer from flooding at the start versus repairing damages later on. And then for our community rating system communities, so for those of you who don't know, the community rating system is a voluntary program that NFIP participating communities can opt into for discounted insurance rates. This happens, these communities adopt higher standards that earn the community credits to raise their class rating or to get a better rating. So these class ratings determine how much of a discount communities receive on flood insurance. So by adopting more higher standards, you earn more credit, you get a higher discount on your insurance premiums. An example of this is with the freeboard requirement. For having a 1 foot freeboard, which is again a Nebraska state standard, a community can earn 100 CRS or points for CRS credits. For having a 2 foot freeboard, the community can get 225 points, and a 3 foot freeboard can get a community 375 points. So there are some benefits if you are a CRS participating community. Some real life examples across the state. Communities with a higher freeboard include Cass County, Douglas County, the city of Rulo, the city of Lincoln. The city of Wahoo requires backflow protection for new subdivisions to prevent sewage backups. And then Bennett and Scottsbluff both prohibit all types of development in the floodway. So if you're interested in adopting any of these higher standards but have some additional questions and would like to reach out to floodplain administrators that currently have these standards, we would recommend reaching out to those communities. And then when is a good time to include higher standards into your ordinance? When you are updating your ordinance, if you currently have a non-compliant or outdated ordinance, that is a good time to go through and consider higher standards. If you're drafting an amendment or a new ordinance, it's easier to include those requirements there. If you're going through a mapping update, you will have to update your ordinance either with an amendment or a new draft. So that would be a good time to include higher standards with those updates. If your community is updating zoning regulations, that would be a good time to include higher floodplain standards with other community or administrative updates. And then if you have a new floodplain administrator or will be getting a new floodplain administrator, we always recommend going through and reviewing your regulations to see if anything needs to be updated, and you can include higher standards with that as well. So we'll go through this pretty quickly as this is in a lot of our other trainings, but the process of updating your ordinance, you would first go to your board, review the model ordinance, choose to keep or remove any optional language. This would include your higher standards, and assign the floodplain administrator position. Once the draft is done, you would submit it to our office here at the state for a review and a cross-check to make sure that all of the standards are met. We will provide any comments on anything that's missing or incorrect. So if any of the higher standards are put in incorrectly or used incorrectly, we'll let you know. And then it's the community's responsibility to make those changes. Once we have approved a draft, we will send it over to FEMA for final approval. And if they have any comments, they will return it to us and we will help you fix those. And then once that is approved, we will return that draft copy to the community for final adoption. And then you would just send a final sign and stamp copy of that ordinance back to us. So some tips for enforcing higher standards. It's important when you're considering higher standards to consider your community's flood risks and needs. Some of these higher standards may not be applicable for or reasonably enforceable in your community, so only consider higher standards if you're committed to enforcing them. Make sure you're considering historical flooding and new development when you're going through these higher standards. So a couple of questions you should ask or look into is how often flooding occurs, how many properties experience frequent flooding, and so on. And then choose higher standards that benefit your community. It's important to have a plan to address existing structures. So when new standards are adopted, existing structures can typically remain as is unless it becomes substantially damaged or improved, in which case it needs to be brought into compliance with the new ordinance. And then have a plan for informing community members about the higher standards that were adopted. So they should be published or shared on a community website, in a newspaper, office buildings, or at public meetings. And then it's important, things that can help you enforce these standards is by sharing outreach materials with the public, educating your community members on the local flood risks, and reaching out to property owners that could benefit from these higher standards. Use your ordinance to your advantage, so it contains all of your enforcement authority and the required language for these regulation standards. So use that to back up your stance. Work with your governing body, and again, ask us, our Nebraska Floodplain Management team, for help. We are available to speak with community officials or attend community meetings to help answer questions. All you have to do is reach out to us and ask. And again, all ordinance updates must be reviewed by our office prior to adoption, so we can help you adopt those higher standards as needed. For the education aspect, we do have a few promotional materials that are available to communities on our website. We do have a floodplain management higher standards brochure that we created that is available for use. We post informational posts on our social media that you can share on websites or your own social media, and then just post information in high traffic areas. You can send out mailers as well. All right, perfect. So we are going a little bit over time. That is all the main content that we have, but we do have some updates with some things we've been working on. So For our new model ordinance, we have started a pilot period. So there are about 4 Nebraska communities that are either we're on adopting or drafting new ordinances using this new model. Once that is done, we're just waiting on some final comments from FEMA before the model will be released, and we're hoping to release it before the end of 2025, as long as we are able to stick to schedule. So just keep an eye out for that, and we'll be announcing that some point soon. And then just some upcoming trainings we have. We will have our basic floodplain management virtual session on December 11th. And then our substantial damage inspection, that will be an interactive course on January 15th. Both of those you can register for on our website. Just a general plug, go ahead, you can follow us on social media. Again, we post a lot of informational posts, updates about things that we're working on. So it's a good way to stay updated with things that are going on in floodplain management. But with that, I appreciate all of you guys for sticking around. We are a few minutes over today, but